Okay, something I'd like to talk about really quickly is just making shortcuts for the brushes that you need to be using during the sculpting process. I think a lot of what will help streamline your workflow in ZBrush is learning the keyboard shortcuts and trying to get quicker and more fluid with your sculpting in that way. So a very useful method to assign certain brushes to keyboard shortcuts is to do the following. So navigate into your lightbox and then go and find the brush that you want. In this particular instance, I'd like to get access to the Trim Smooth Borders brush. This is a very handy brush for a lot of different sculpting, but particularly rock sculpting. So once you've navigated into that area of the lightbox and selected the brush that you need, just double click on that and that'll select that brush and then put it into the brush's selection for this particular scene. Then click off that brush and then go and find that brush in your brushes palette. So you can see I'm hovering over the Trim Smooth Borders brush now, and then hold down Control and Alt and click on that brush, and with your mouse still hovered or your stylus still hovered over that brush, hit any key, I've used numerical keys, so in this case I've used the key number 4. Press that key and that will assign that particular brush to that key. So Control Alt click and then press 5, and now if I toggle through my different numerical keys, you can see with 5 I've landed on my Trim Smooth Borders brush. And so now I'm going to start, effectively what I'm going to start doing is start bashing away at some of the rough detail that I've sculpted, and because there's all that undulating surface, it'll give the Trim Smooth Borders brush something quite nice to play with. So to be honest, if I thought about this in certain ways, I've probably introduced a whole ton of detail and now I'm just going to smooth away some of that detail. Perhaps I could have adjusted my workflow in a slightly different way when I was tackling this, but having all of that undulating surface does give the Trim Smooth Borders brush a lot to work with, and you get all these different angular faces playing off each other, and then as a result you get nice little dings and rivets, sorry, not rivets, just dings and notches appearing in the surface of the rock, and it gives it kind of a nice, fairly natural eroded quality to it. So yeah, we're just going to work through this, kind of bashing away at some of these areas, trying to give, I guess, a fairly natural rock-like finish to the surface. Before was a really kind of blobby, just a blobby texture, and I think it wasn't really working. Just kind of looking back at the reference now to get a sense of how far I'd need to go, and I think I'm probably kind of deciding that that I'm going to exaggerate what I see in the reference, you know, just to add a certain amount of texture to this rock, which perhaps it's not quite as exaggerated in the reference image that I'm using. Another thing that's obvious from the reference is the very sharp edges along the kind of the overall shapes of the rock, and these sharp ridges. And you'll see that I've kind of lost those a lot through all of my process of using the clay build-up brush and now the Trim Smooth Borders brush. We're going to lose a lot of that detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a brush called the Dam Standard brush, which is very handy for raising up these very sharp defined areas. And once again, in keeping with the theme of trying to use keyboard shortcuts to speed up our workflow and make things a little bit more fluid, a great way to do that is to hit the B key and then the D key and then the S key, and that will bring you to the Dam Standard brush. Now by default, the Dam Standard brush will indent the surface, so when you're making these strokes you want to hold down the Alt key just to raise them up and pinch them up. And so you can see I'm just choosing a line along the top ridge of this rock, very similar to what's in the reference image, and trying to pinch that and raise it up. And then through a combination of that and the Trim Smooth Borders brush, I'm just going along and trying to just to sharpen up that edge and start to give some shape and some form to that edge. And then every time I feel like I've distorted the mesh a little bit too much, I just control, click and drag, and we're still in Dynamesh mode, so that will remesh the whole mesh and kind of even out the poly distribution in areas where I've kind of warped the mesh or stretched it a little bit too much through the sculpting process. And then I just continue on and keep kind of chipping away at this rock. Just another thing that's useful to mention is that when you're navigating around your model in ZBrush, if you come over to the menu on the right hand side and click on the rotate around y-axis icon, that's just a little Y, you will it'll just help you to navigate around that model in a way that's a little bit more familiar to Max and Maya users. Okay, now I've just selected the move brush and I'm kind of coming back into certain areas and just kind of pushing and pulling some of the forms around a little bit just to exaggerate certain areas that I feel could do with a little bit more exaggerated shape. And then once again, we can come back in with the Trim Smooth Borders brush and chip away at these. But yeah, you can see just looking at the silhouette in certain places, I kind of felt like, okay, let's stretch out certain corners and just try and exaggerate the shape of certain things just to try and give the whole thing a little bit more character. And then once again, control, click and drag to Dynamesh as we need to, because obviously the move tool is going to stretch out some of those polygons. So you kind of want to remesh that just to give it a nice even distribution of polygon sizes. Now I'm coming in kind of at a smaller scale, just with a smaller size brush. Again, my Trim Smooth Borders brush, and just trying to tackle areas of a little bit finer detail, just to kind of experiment and see what that looks like. To be honest, it looks like I don't really have the resolution that I need to kind of go into that sort of detail yet. So we'll just save our mesh and save our project, save our tool rather, and then save our project. Yeah, and just a close examination of the mesh, you can kind of see that we probably don't really have the resolution we need to start getting into that level of detail. So just turning off the Dynamesh now and adding a layer of subdivision to that. That brings us up to a higher resolution. And then I've deleted the lower level of resolution. we can see we're at a count of just over 1 million polys now. And I'm just exploring with the Dynamesh just to try and find an ideal resolution. That's probably a little bit better at a resolution of just below 1 million. We kind of have probably enough of the detail we need to start sculpting in some detail at in those kind of finer areas that we want to address. Also, just starting to have a go at the mesh with the Trim Smooth Borders brush, I felt it was appropriate to add a square alpha to that, just to give a little bit more definition to the shape that we're attacking the mesh with. Yeah, and you can see compared to the option with no alpha, this just gives us just a bit more of an angular, rocky finish to those brush strokes. So I think it's a good idea to introduce that alpha from time to time. And then, like before, in the previous lesson, I'm kind of just going through adding up a finer layer of detail now. I guess we did it in more of a macro level before. Now we're looking at it in kind of a smaller scale. Although I can see where I'm going with this, and that is that I'm going to need to be just a little bit careful about the areas I select, otherwise I could end up just taking this approach and applying it to the entire mesh once again, which probably won't be the most effective way of dealing with it, because we've just spent a bunch of time trying to smooth out some of the detail we introduced before. So I think it's just a case of thinking about where a shape like this would need some of that detail. But it's little details and areas like this that are really going to get set off when we bring all of this into Substance Painter, and yeah, start using the high resolution mesh that we've sculpted to help Substance generate some of the grit and the grime, and just use that high detail sculpt to get a little bit more additional textural information when we start painting. So now what I'm going to try doing is masking out some areas on the mesh where I actually feel the kind of smoother, like larger, exaggerated, flat, angular forms are actually quite nice. You can see the nice one on the bottom corner there. And all I'm doing is just holding down Control and then painting onto the mesh. Yeah, holding down Control and painting onto the mesh just to mask these areas out. So when I come back in and start chipping away again with the Trim Smooth Borders brush, these areas will actually be preserved, and some of those kind of nicer, bigger, flat shapes that I've added in will be largely unaffected by some of the detail work that I do. And so I'm just going to speed up the video now, and just so you don't need to watch me kind of going through and adding loads and loads of detail. I'm using the clay build-up brush again just to add a kind of layer of detail back on top of what we've done with the Trim Smooth Borders brush, but at a finer sort of resolution and detail than what we had before. So a combination of clay buildup and Trim Smooth Borders to try and add a nice rocky texture to certain areas, but then of course these areas that are masked, they'll remain unaffected by the work that we're doing. So you'll have kind of some areas that are sort of fine and gritty, and then other areas that have these nice big flat shapes preserved. And then once again, kind of like what we did in the first video, maybe looking at certain areas of the rock that can be exaggerated, or certain forms that can be pulled out, or just trying to imagine how erosion might have affected the rock, or just how we're going to get some of these nice sharp edges and little overhangs and things like that in the rock. Once again, in some areas I'm using the damn standard brush and holding Alt when I perform the stroke, just to pinch up certain areas and try and introduce a kind of raised, nice angular edge to the rock, you know, perhaps where it might have sheared off another rock, just trying to help create the form that we're seeing in the reference image. And I think something to note about this process is it comes to mind a very talented artist, environment artist friend of mine once told me that with ZBrush your confidence tends to grow with each brush stroke. And so it's a good idea to just kind of have fun with it and almost be a little bit reckless, especially with something like a rock. This is not an incredibly precise thing, so you can kind of just go for it and just hack away at the thing, with a bit of thought, of course. But yeah, it can be a nice kind of exercise to help build your confidence with the tool, and just figure out what some of the different brushes do, and figure out how you can affect these shapes and make these incredible organic things with a digital tool. And again, in some areas, I'm just coming back in and painting a mask just to protect some of the nice sharp edges that I've already got on the corners of the rock. And you can see in some areas we are starting to get kind of nice rocky forms just through the through that trim smooth borders brush. It's just an older image that I created there, popping up real quickly on the screen, just looking at that occasionally too for a bit of reference. Yeah, and once again, just coming in with the mask to protect the edges that I've created already. Don't want to mess those up now that I've spent a bit of time kind of adding a sharp ridge to there. Just another quick tip with the masking: if you've painted into an area to mask it, and then you hold the control and you actually just tap on the mesh, it'll blur that mask and soften that mask, just so that you get a nice soft mask gradient into the masked area. So as you can see, going forward, I'm just using a combination of masking, the clay buildup brush, the trim smooth borders brush, and then also occasionally the move tool, just to help exaggerate some of the forms and the shapes that we're dealing with. Okay, now I'm just inverting the mask just to have a quick look at the areas that were previously masked that have not been subjected to any of the detail work that we've been doing right now, and just navigating around and examining the mesh. And just control click and drag to clear the mesh. Come back into Dynamesh mode and control click and drag to remesh it, just to even out any of the adjustments that we've done. Now we're just going to save our tool once again. And I think we'll leave it there for the moment and catch up in the next video.